So, in social research, a research paradigm, is the philosophical stance informing the methodology and thus providing a context for the process and grounding of its logic and criteria. So, in other words, what that means is a paradigm is like a bundle of philosophical beliefs and assumptions that guides, grounds, and justifies the research methodology that a researcher uses to study a problem or a question. One of the first components is that a paradigm describes the researcher's view of the human world and social life within that world. So remember we talked about ontology? So ontology would be the researcher's beliefs about reality, about existence, about the way the world is structured, and in our case, in social research, the way the human world is structured, the way the social world is structured, how human beings live within that world. And the paradigm provides ontological, remember that's reality, beliefs about reality, existence, epistemological, beliefs about knowledge, theory of knowledge, what is possible to be known, what the criteria are for what counts as knowledge, as in distinction of other types of belief, and what criteria would need to be provided in order to justify knowledge claims. Axiology, remember, is the study of values. So this would be ethics, politics, normative beliefs about the way things ought to be that would guide and ground a study. These are emphasized in the critical orientation, if you remember. It's very much guided toward the goal of what Habermas called the emancipatory interests. Social justice or socialist ends, egalitarian ends. The axiology for critical theory is neo-Marxism. So it's very much value-oriented, even though it has ontological positions, beliefs about what knowledge is and how it's constructed and so on. But the emphasis is axiological. It's about social justice, the way society ought to be structured according to a neo-Marxist framework. And every paradigm has an ontological component, an epistemological component, and an axiological component. The degree of emphasis varies. So here's a little bit more detail about ontology. A quick definition: the study of being or existence, concerned with what is, what exists, the nature of reality and its structure, the nature of existence. So what does it mean to be a human being, for example? Heidegger, one of the philosophers we'll study, that was one of his ontological questions. What does it mean to be a human? A human being in the world is his translated language. And again, not just what exists, but what is its structure, what are its properties, what is it like, what are the various entities of reality like. So ontology is really a branch of metaphysics. That's a body of philosophy, an area of philosophy. We won't get too much into metaphysics, but metaphysics would include not just science and philosophy, but also theology. So looking into beliefs about the supernatural, for example. Spiritual matters would also be included under that umbrella of metaphysics. But in science and social science and the humanities, we typically limit, we would draw lines between the supernatural and the natural and just focus on the natural phenomena. All right, two different types of ontological positions. These are sort of, I guess, the major ones in social science and the humanities. One ontological position would be what we could call realism, and another one would be idealism. So realism suggests that the world exists independently of the knower. So I am a conscious subject in the world. A realist ontology would suggest that other objects like tables and chairs and rocks and creeks and rivers and streams and volcanoes, dinosaur bones and animals and so on exist independently of my consciousness. That there is a world of things outside of my head, outside of my consciousness, and no matter what I think or believe about it, it is what it is. What it is. Okay, so that's a realist ontology. An idealist ontology or idealism suggests that the world cannot exist independently of the mind or of ideas. Now, this is where maybe my subjectivity or my bias is going to be pretty evident, but I'm not sure that too many people believe in a radical form of idealism. If so, people would exit hotels off the 80th floor and wouldn't be too worried about falling to their imminent doom and death. They obviously believe that there is physical and chemical reality, that just by the way they behave. But I think what they're saying with idealism as an ontology is that it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to separate the knowing subject from the known object completely. So when I make meaning of a tree, yes, something exists that I perceive as a tree. There is some object of reality. But I can never know what that object is inherently like. I can never know what its essential objective qualities and features are because I filter everything through my consciousness, through my subjectivity. So it's not so much that too many scholars believe that there is no such thing as a world outside of their heads. If they did, I think that'd be extremely egocentric and strange and narcissistic. Maybe some of them do, but I just don't believe that most thoughtful scholars would hold that extreme caricatured position. The note at the bottom here, many scholars lie somewhere between these positions, believing that a real reality exists, but that it and human minds are structured in such a way that reality itself is not directly accessible or fully knowable. So if we talked about, we're going to get to epistemology soon, but keep that in mind, that realism and idealism might be polar opposites on a continuum rather than just a simple binary. It's not black and white. There's this huge gray area in between these two extreme positions. Your beliefs about reality are going to influence your beliefs about knowledge. And epistemology is the theory of knowledge. It's a theory of knowing and knowledge embedded in the paradigm and thereby in the methodology. So if epistemology is one of the components of a paradigm, alongside ontology and axiology, together those three components are going to influence the methodology, the research design, the way in which people will use particular methods. All of this is going to be guided by philosophical assumptions and beliefs. Epistemology is a way of understanding and explaining how we know what we know, why we believe that we know something. What are the grounds and criteria for believing that we know something about the world? Epistemology deals with the nature of knowledge, its possibility, scope, and general basis. So what can we know, and how can we know it? It is concerned with providing a philosophical grounding for deciding what kinds of knowledge are possible and how we can ensure that they are both adequate and legitimate. So think for a minute, why do we do epistemology? So put your philosopher hat on for just a second. If we were all radical relativists, if we believed that any belief, any claim about the world was just as good as any other claim, then there really wouldn't be any point in going to school. There wouldn't be any point in pursuing an advanced graduate degree and learning how to do rigorous research. So I think most people would say that there are more and less warranted claims about reality. But not everybody believes that there is one perfect, certain, absolute description about reality, and that that's our knowledge, that's our truth, and that all the other things are just mere belief. I think most people, again, would exist on a continuum from absolute certainty on one polar opposite and radical relativism on the other polar opposite. And then there's degrees of warrant in between. Okay. There's a little picture from the Matrix. Remember the scene about the red pill or the blue pill? I encourage you to watch that little clip if you need a refresher. Sometimes different ontological positions are compatible with various epistemological positions, paradigms, and methodologies. Both ontology and epistemology are components of these paradigms. One could have a realist ontology, so remember, believing that a real world of objects exists independently of consciousness, of us as subjects. Constructionism is a type of epistemology that we're going to talk about that is compatible with realism as ontology. And we'll break what constructionism is. We'll break that down and how it contrasts with, on one end, objectivism, and on the other end, subjectivism. So we'll get into more detail about that. But realism and ontology and constructionism and epistemology are compatible with one another. Although realism is most often associated with objectivism. So a realist ontology and objectivist epistemology often feeds into paradigms like positivism or post-positivism that are most commonly associated with science. Ontological issues, remember, issues about reality and existence, and epistemological issues about knowledge and the criteria for knowledge, the possibility of what's knowable, and so on, tend to emerge together, which makes it possible for researchers to mainly focus on the latter. So most researchers don't really have sections of their papers dedicated to explaining their ontology. So if you're a natural scientist, for example, you pretty much assume that most of your readers know that you assume that there's a reality outside of your head. Otherwise, why would you be doing science? You're trying to learn more about reality and the objects of reality, the phenomena of reality. So they don't really talk a whole lot about ontology. In qualitative research and social science, people have maybe a wider range of beliefs and philosophical foundations to their work. So sometimes it's necessary for them to explain their epistemological position in more detail. And it might even be helpful if some of the people in the natural sciences and in the quantitative research approaches would provide a little bit more explanation so that readers would know how to interpret their claims a little better. Okay, so ontology and epistemology, we said that they're related, but there's some conceptual distinctions that are important, yet some thinkers collapse these two concepts into a single idea, or they'll use words interchangeably that there's not good rational justification, in my opinion, for doing that. I think it's helpful to distinguish the difference between reality and knowledge, because I know I've been wrong about reality before, and I didn't know it at the time. It wasn't until later that someone explained something to me, or they showed me evidence for something, and I changed my belief about reality in light of new and better arguments and evidence. So I don't think that that reality itself and people's beliefs about reality are the same thing. But yet these terms are often conflated in some scholarly literature, collapsing the traditional philosophical distinction between ontology and epistemology. So ontological terms like reality or realities, pluralized, are often used in place of epistemological terms like knowledge, which in turn is further conflated with beliefs, perspectives, meanings, and or narratives. So to me, this is slippery thinking and slippery language that um, undermines scholarly clarity, precision. Uh, in my view, one of the major purposes of scholarship is to improve people's beliefs about the world, not just to validate them. So I think that this is a problematic way of using these terms. So, for example, somebody could have a belief, a perspective, they could make a meaning about some phenomenon, or they might have a narrative about the world that may or may not be very well justified by epistemic warrants. So, logical argument, internal consistency or coherence, empirical evidence that other people can see, that's publicly available, that's you know something that's not just based on private experience or private meaning making or subjectivity. But a lot of times I know my beliefs are extremely influenced by subjectivity, and it's not until someone else criticizes them or points out blind spots that I have that I am able to see where I might be wrong about something. So collapsing um, ontology, beliefs about reality, with epistemology, beliefs about knowledge or meaning, that just to me is not a very productive way of doing social inquiry. Here's an example from Guba and Lincoln where I see some of this kind of slippery concept creep or language manipulation. Those who see reality as a construction in the minds of individuals believe there is always an infinite number of constructions that might be made, and hence there are multiple realities. See, on the one hand, they're talking about constructions in someone's mind, which to me sounds an awful lot like a belief. And that there can be multiple constructions. So it's a fact that people hold different beliefs, okay? And from there, they jump to the claim that there are multiple realities. But that does not necessarily logically flow from the fact that people have different beliefs about reality. It doesn't necessarily flow that there are multiple realities. There could be, not necessarily, but there could be a single reality and multiple perspectives about reality, multiple beliefs about reality, multiple meanings that people make, multiple narratives that have been constructed. But by making that distinction, we're making a distinction between ontology and epistemology. Events, persons, objects are indeed tangible entities. Okay, that's an ontological claim. These are things that exist in reality. The meanings and wholeness derived from or ascribed to these tangible phenomena, in order to make sense of them, organize them, or reorganize a belief system, however, are constructed realities. Now, why do we have to call those realities? Why can't we just call them beliefs or meanings or understandings or perspectives or narratives? Because when you call them constructed realities, that's a relativistic move. It's a way of saying that your belief is reality. Your sense making of the world is reality itself. Okay. Their basic assumption about the nature of reality is that it doesn't exist until, let's emphasize that, Reality doesn't exist until it is constructed by an actor. Now that is awfully subjectivist. Let's think back to the Matrix for a second. The world doesn't exist until the subject thinks about it. That to me sounds like pure subjectivism. Whereas a pure objectivism would say the world exists completely the way it is. Our beliefs about it, our knowledge about the world can directly reflect the world itself without us contributing anything to knowledge. We just report what we see, like a mirror image of reality. So if both of those are naive, like a naive objectivism on one end and a naive subjectivism on the other end, most research is constructionist in epistemology. But that doesn't mean that it's radically relativist. I think Guba and Lincoln's statement is radically relativist. Epistemology. It's helpful to look at the different approaches to epistemology, and they can mainly be broken into three categories or three theories of knowledge. First is objectivism. Knowledge comes from the object. So if I'm studying a tree, the tree exists. The tree exists as a tree, independently of consciousness, and it has intrinsic properties, treeness, if you will. It has an essence of treeness, and we can study that treeness as a phenomenon, or the tree as an object, and understand those properties of treeness, its qualities, its inherent properties. We can study that, and we can know it with a high degree of certainty, if not absolute certainty. And in that process, humans discovering the tree's properties through objectivist analysis of sense data, so data that enters our brain through our senses, the result of which is knowledge of the tree's objective properties, and that this excludes any subjective contribution from the knower. In other words, when I look at a tree, when I experience a tree, if I climbed a tree when I was a kid, or if I smelled the awful smell of a Bradford pear tree blossoming in the spring, if I cut down a tree and used the wood to build a fire, those are all ways of experiencing a tree. The objectivist approach would say it is what it is, and we can know it based on that experience without contributing any meaning to it that we've constructed on our own or that we've subjectively imposed. So when we take an objectivist approach to the social sciences, talking about human beings and the human world, the social world, if you take an objectivist approach to the social world, it's like applying the tools of natural science to the study of human beings. So it's almost like studying a person like we might study a tree or a rock to try to understand its inherent qualities, its inherent properties, and so on. The assumption of objectivist epistemology in the social sciences is that if we go about it in the right way, we can discover objective knowledge about human beings, their beliefs, behaviors, the institutions they create, and so on. Objectivism holds that a real world of objects and natural phenomena exists apart from any consciousness. Remember, that's a realist ontology. The world of objects and phenomena exists outside of my head, outside of my consciousness, outside of my awareness of them, my feelings about them, any kind of subjective consideration. Knowledge is human discovery of facts inherent in these objects and phenomena. Again, that's an objectivist epistemology. That is the basis for science traditionally understood in the West, or positivist science, which we'll talk about more.